The night the Carter estate's security cameras captured the argument in the driveway, the entire household froze. A young woman stood in the pouring rain, gripping a suitcase. Across from her stood the most powerful man in the house, a billionaire American businessman known for controlling everything around him. And then, in a voice cold enough to silence the storm, he said, "Leave this house and never come back." The woman didn't cry. She didn't beg. Instead, she said something that would haunt the Carter family for the next 10 years. "You'll regret this." And then she walked away into the darkness. But the real question is this: how did a quiet African maid end up at the center of a scandal inside one of the wealthiest homes in America? And how did the same girl who was thrown out like trash eventually return as the man's favorite daughter-in-law? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. 10 years ago. The Carter estate stood on a quiet hill outside Seattle, a mansion so large that it looked more like a luxury hotel than home. Its owner, Richard Carter, was known across the business world as a ruthless strategist. He had built his technology empire through sharp deals and relentless ambition. Employees feared him, competitors respected him. Inside his house, the same rules applied. Richard Carter controlled everything. Every staff member, every family decision, every detail. His household ran like a corporation. And among the dozens of employees working inside the mansion, there was one new arrival. Her name was Amina Okafor. She had come from a small village in West Africa. Her mother had worked tirelessly to give her an education, but after her father died, money disappeared quickly. So when an agency offered her a position working for a wealthy American family, she accepted. To Amina, the Carter estate was overwhelming. The marble floors, the towering glass windows, the endless hallways. But what struck her most was how quiet the house felt. It was beautiful, but cold. Amina worked hard. She cleaned rooms, prepared guest spaces, helped in the kitchen. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. Within weeks, most of the staff barely noticed her presence. But someone did. The master's youngest son, Daniel Carter. Daniel was different from the rest of the family. While Richard Carter ran a billion-dollar company, Daniel avoided the business world entirely. He studied architecture, he traveled, and he had a reputation for being the only member of the family who treated the staff like human beings. The first time Daniel noticed Amina was simple. She was in the library late one night dusting the shelves. He walked in and saw her reading one of the books she was supposed to clean. She immediately closed it, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just—" Daniel laughed. "You don't have to call me sir." That moment changed everything. After that night, their paths began crossing more often. Small conversations turned into longer ones. Daniel discovered that Amina loved books. She had dreamed of studying literature, but life had taken her somewhere else. Amina discovered that Daniel hated the expectations of his powerful father. He didn't want to inherit the company. He wanted freedom. They came from completely different worlds, yet somehow they understood each other. Weeks turned into months. The quiet conversations in the library became the best part of their days. At first, it was friendship. Then something deeper began to grow. Something dangerous. Because in the Carter household, there was one rule everyone understood without saying it. Staff were invisible, and they certainly were not allowed to fall in love with the family. But love doesn't ask permission. One night, after a late dinner party, the mansion finally grew quiet. Amina stepped outside into the garden for air. The moonlight covered the lawn like silver, and Daniel was already there. They talked for nearly an hour. About dreams, about fear, about what it meant to feel trapped in someone else's expectations. And when Daniel finally looked at her, something had changed. "I don't want you to leave someday," he said quietly. Amina felt her heart race. "That's not my choice." Daniel stepped closer. "It could be." The moment hung in the air. Then he kissed her. It was brief, soft, but it changed their lives forever. Because someone was watching. From the upstairs balcony, Richard Carter's eldest daughter. And by morning, the entire household knew. The reaction was immediate, cold, explosive. Amina was summoned to Richard Carter's private office. The room felt like a courtroom. Richard sat behind his desk. Her daughter stood beside him. Daniel stood near the window, tense. Richard's voice was calm, too calm. "Is it true?" Amina kept her eyes down. "Yes, sir." Silence filled the room. Richard Carter leaned forward slowly. His eyes hardened. "You were hired to serve this household." Amina felt the room tighten around her. Richard's eyes hardened. "Not to seduce my son." Amina opened her mouth. "I didn't—" Suddenly, Richard slammed his hand on the desk. The sound echoed through the office. "Enough." Daniel stepped forward. "Father, that's not what happened." Richard turned toward him, his expression colder than Daniel had ever seen. "Be quiet." For the first time in Daniel's life, his father looked at him like a stranger. Then he turned back to Amina. "You will pack your belongings tonight." The words fell like a hammer. "You will leave this house." Amina's hands began to shake. "But I love him." The room went silent. Richard Carter slowly stood, and the fury in his eyes made it clear those 3 words had sealed her fate. "Get out of my house." And as Amina walked out of the office that night, she had no idea that 10 years later, she would walk back through the same doors, and the power in that house would belong to her. But before we continue, if you enjoy suspenseful true crime-style stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Because what happens next inside the Carter family changes everything. Because the worst part of Amina's nightmare hadn't even begun yet. And by the time the truth about the Carter family finally surfaced, someone would wish they had never forced her to leave. The Carter estate looked peaceful from the outside. Tall white walls, perfect gardens, security gates guarding every entrance. But inside, something darker had begun to grow. Because the night Amina was ordered to leave the house, Daniel Carter refused to accept it. And that decision would ignite a war inside the Carter family. But the story doesn't start with Daniel. It starts with what happened after Amina left the mansion. She didn't return to Africa. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of Seattle, using the little money she had saved from months of work. For the first time since arriving in America, she was completely alone. No job, no family, no future. And the worst part wasn't the money. It was the silence. Daniel had promised he would call, but the days passed without a word. What Amina didn't know was that Richard Carter had already made sure of that. Inside the Carter estate, the tension between father and son exploded. Daniel stormed into his father's office the next morning. "You had no right to throw her out." Richard didn't even look up from his laptop. "I had every right. She didn't do anything wrong." Richard closed the laptop slowly. "Your judgment has been compromised." Daniel's voice shook with anger. "I love her." For a moment, the room went still. Then Richard Carter stood. "You are a Carter. So what? You do not marry the help." The words hit like a slap. Daniel stared at his father in disbelief. "You think she's beneath us?" Richard's expression hardened. "I think she saw an opportunity." Daniel's fists clenched. "You don't even know her." Richard walked toward the window overlooking the estate. "I know exactly how the world works." And with that, the conversation was over. But Richard Carter didn't stop there.
Within days, Amina began noticing something strange. Every job she applied for suddenly disappeared. Interviews were canceled. Applications were rejected without explanation. At first, she thought it was bad luck, but the truth was far terrifying. Richard Carter had quietly made a few calls, and in his world, those calls carried enormous power. To him, it was simple. If Amina couldn't find stability, she would eventually leave the country, and Daniel would forget her. But Richard had underestimated two things: Daniel's stubbornness and Amina's resilience. Weeks later, Daniel finally found a way to contact her. They met secretly at a small cafe downtown. The moment Amina saw him, months of pain rushed back. "You didn't call." Daniel looked exhausted. "My father blocked everything." Amina sighed. "He's already won." Daniel shook his head. "No." He took her hand. "We'll figure this out." But the reality was harsh. Daniel depended financially on his father, and Richard Carter had already drawn the battle lines. Daniel faced a brutal choice: his family or Amina. And in the weeks that followed, the pressure became unbearable. Richard cut off Daniel's credit cards, removed him from family accounts, even threatened to remove him from the will. The message was clear: walk away from the Maid, or walk away from everything. Meanwhile, Amina faced a different kind of war. Bills piled up, rent was overdue, and every door she knocked on seemed to close. But one night changed everything. While cleaning tables at a temporary restaurant job she had managed to get under the radar, a customer noticed her reading during her break. He was an older professor from a nearby university. They started talking, and when he heard her story, he said something simple: "You're too smart to stay stuck here." Weeks later, Amina enrolled in night classes. It was exhausting. She worked during the day, studied at night, slowly rebuilding a life that had nearly collapsed. But then something happened that shattered everything again. Daniel stopped answering her messages. At first, she thought he was busy. Then days turned into weeks, and the truth finally arrived in a brutal headline. Daniel Carter had left the country, and no one knew where he went. The article described it as a personal sabbatical, but Amina understood what it really meant. Richard Carter had won. Daniel was gone, and she was alone. But before we continue, if you've been enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this reveal how power, love, and betrayal collide in ways no one expects. Because Amina's story was far from over. In fact, the moment Daniel disappeared, something inside her changed. She stopped waiting, stopped hoping, stopped believing someone else would save her. Instead, she made a decision. If the Carter family thought they could erase her, they were wrong. The first year nearly broke her. Between working long shifts and attending night classes, Amina barely slept. Some nights she studied until sunrise. Other nights she fell asleep with textbooks open on the table. And during her first major law exam, she failed. When she saw the results posted on the board, the letters blurred in front of her eyes. For a moment, she wondered if Richard Carter had been right about her all along. But quitting wasn't an option. So she tried again. Years later, during her internship at a small law firm, Amina handled her first real case. It involved a migrant construction worker who had been cheated out of his wages by a wealthy contractor.
Most lawyers ignored the case, but Amina didn't. She worked on it for weeks, gathering evidence, studying the law late into the night. And when the court ruled in their favor, the worker cried outside the courthouse. That was the moment Amina realized something powerful. She was no longer powerless. But success didn't come easily. One winter night, after another exhausting shift and another stack of unpaid bills, Amina sat alone in her tiny apartment. Her textbooks lay open on the table. For a long time, she stared at them. Then she slowly closed the books. "Maybe this isn't my world," she whispered. For the first time since leaving the Carter estate, She thought about giving up. But then she remembered something Richard Carter once told her. You forget your place. And suddenly, quitting was no longer an option. Meanwhile, Richard Carter continued expanding his empire. The world saw him as untouchable, but what no one realized was that the quiet girl he once threw out of his mansion was slowly becoming someone powerful enough to walk back through those doors. And when she finally returned to the Carter estate 10 years later, everything inside that house would change. Because this time, Amina wasn't coming back as a maid, and the truth about Daniel Carter was about to shock everyone. 10 years after the night she was thrown out of the Carter estate, Amina Okafor stepped out of a black car in front of the same gates. But everything about her had changed. Gone was the quiet maid who once cleaned the mansion floors. Now she stood confident, composed, dressed in a tailored suit that reflected years of hard-earned success. Security guards watched her approach. One of them hesitated. "Can I help you?" Amina smiled slightly. "Yes." She handed him a small card. "Tell Mr. Richard Carter his daughter-in-law is here." The guard frowned in confusion, but minutes later, the mansion doors opened, and Richard Carter himself stepped outside. The moment he saw her, his expression froze, because the last time he saw Amina, she was leaving with a suitcase. Now she had returned like someone who belonged there. But the real shock came moments later, when another car pulled into the driveway, and the man who stepped out was someone the Carter family hadn't seen in a decade. Daniel Carter, alive, healthy, and walking straight toward Amina. The truth finally began to unfold. 10 years earlier, after his final fight with his father, Daniel had made a decision. He disappeared from the Carter empire entirely. No inheritance, no family money. He started over in Europe. At first, it was brutal, but slowly he built his own architectural firm from scratch. The two of them reconnected years later, not through desperation, but through growth. The love that once seemed impossible had survived time, distance, and pain, and eventually they married quietly. Now they had returned, not to beg, not to fight, but to reveal the truth. Inside the mansion, the Carter family gathered in stunned silence. Richard Carter stared at his son. "You married her." Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes." Richard turned toward Amina. "You planned this." Amina shook her head. "No." Her voice was steady. "You created this." For the first time in decades, Richard Carter had no response. But the biggest twist came moments later. Daniel placed a document on the table. "Our company just finalized a major contract." Richard looked down. His eyes widened. It was a partnership agreement between Daniel's rapidly growing architecture firm and Richard Carter's own company. But there was one condition written clearly at the bottom. The lead legal advisor overseeing the deal would be Amina Okafor, the maid he once humiliated. Now the woman controlling one of the most important deals his company had ever signed. Silence filled the room, and then something unexpected happened. Richard Carter slowly sat down. For the first time in his life, he looked defeated. "You came back to prove a point." Amina shook her head again. "No." She looked around the mansion, the same place that once made her feel invisible. "I came back because this is family now." Then she looked at Richard, and family should treat each other better. The old billionaire stared at her for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded, because deep down, he knew the truth. The girl he once threw away had become something far greater than he ever imagined. She had become the one person strong enough to challenge him, and maybe even change him. But if you think that moment ended the story, think again. Because the Carter family would spend years learning something powerful. Sometimes the people we try hardest to erase become the ones who rewrite the entire story. And in the end, the maid who once had nothing became the most respected woman in the Carter family. Not through revenge,
but through resilience. And the man who once told her to leave his house forever eventually introduced her proudly to his business partners with words no one ever expected to hear. "This is my daughter-in-law." And for the first time, he meant it. If you believe Richard Carter treated Amina unfairly simply because of her social status, tell us what you think about his actions. If you believe Amina returning as a powerful woman was the ultimate form of justice, comment "Resilience wins." And now I'm really curious to hear your perspective. Would you have forgiven the Carter family if you were in Amina's position, or would you have walked away forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful true crime style stories, and subscribe to the channel for more chilling, emotional, and unforgettable true crime narratives, because the next story might be even shocking.